Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Carmelo, why do you keep hesitating? Carolina protested. Are you a man, or what? Why do I always have to make decisions for you? I don't want to go to prison, Carmelo protested in a hushed voice. Don't you understand? What if someone finds out? What if there's an investigation? Your husband is not an ordinary person, and his death, especially under such strange circumstances, won't go unnoticed. You don't realize what you're doing. Of course, keep going, Carolina continued to whisper angrily. It's not like you have to sleep with him every night. And really, aren't you disgusted with picking up scraps from his table yourself? How do you even feel about yourself? I'd be sickened by now, but it seems like you don't care. Carmelo let out a heavy sigh. I do care, but it wasn't me who forced you to marry him. You agreed to this marriage yourself. I agreed? You know perfectly well that it was my father who insisted on the wedding. It was essential for his business. Besides, in your place, I'd keep my mouth shut. You know it's not just about my father, and not even primarily about him. This marriage was the only way to resolve the situation and your debts. Who asked you to agree to work for his father? And to accumulate debts on top of that? Everyone wants to live the good life, but when it's time to pay for it and solve problems, it's all I have nothing to do with this. I won't go along with it. Pull yourself together, for once, and get it done. Now is the best time and place to get rid of him once and for all and live in peace. All you have to do is go into the room, unplug the cord from the socket for a few minutes, and then plug it back in. He can't breathe on his own. They'll blame it on some kind of electrical malfunction or power outage. No one will ever suspect a thing, and you can't even do that. You're spineless. Yes, but in this hospital, any electrical malfunctions or power outages never happen. Who would believe this nonsense in the first place? Do you even realize what you're suggesting I do? This is not just the best hospital in the city, he funded its construction himself. The entire staff trembles at his presence, from the head doctor to the janitor. No one will ever believe it's anything but an unfortunate accident, and then I'll have to answer for it. Come on, my dear, let's leave it to fate. If he succumbs on his own, that's his path. And if not, when he gets back on his feet, we'll come up with something smarter and more plausible. They continued to argue, and Leisha was listening to their conversation, realizing that he hadn't changed at all since the last time they saw each other. He was still a confident person who could solve any problems and was convinced that he could conquer the world. Only now was his worldview bolstered by his own wealth, connections, and opportunities. She recognized him the moment she entered the room to clean the floors and wipe the tables, but he wouldn't recognize her even if he wanted to badly. She tried not to think about that time. It weighed too heavily on her soul. It seemed that in the past 15 years, she could have forgotten much more, but she remembered everything to the smallest details, as if it had happened just yesterday. And when she saw him lying so helpless on the hospital bed, on the verge of crossing over to the other side, the events of days long gone replayed in her mind. It's so wonderful to see you, Leisha. Well done. You got into medical school by yourself, Ramona Vega, the caretaker from the orphanage where Leisha had grown up, exclaimed. Leisha had maintained a connection with Ramona even after leaving the orphanage. Now, all doors are open to you. It's prestigious. You'll receive your degree, buy an apartment, and move out of your tiny orphanage room. Your parents would have been so proud of you. I wish I knew who they were. But honestly, that doesn't matter anymore, Leisha replied. Leisha had never seen her mother or father. She was one of those children whom their parents had abandoned immediately after birth. She spent her childhood within the orphanage walls, and she couldn't describe it as happy. Only Ramona, who treated Leisha like her own daughter, brought her joy. Whenever possible, Ramona would give her gifts, treat her to sweets, and buy books and notebooks to ensure Leisha grew up educated and well-rounded. After graduation, Leisha lived like everyone else. She hadn't managed to get into the coveted medical faculty on her first try, so she had to start working to make a living. Don't be upset, Ramona reassured her. You'll get in next year. You have your whole life ahead of you. No need to rush. But all the spots are taken this year by wealthy people, Leisha despairingly argued. I could have gotten in this year, but as you can imagine, all the positions were filled. Don't talk nonsense. That's ridiculous. Ramona was indignant. You'll get in, and there's no way around it. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. Ramona had to work hard to persuade Leisha not to give up on her dream. And when, a year later, Leisha saw her name on the list of admitted students, she could hardly believe her eyes. It worked. Can you believe it worked? She exclaimed joyfully. There is justice in the world, after all. All my efforts paid off. Now everything will be fine. I'll earn my degree and move mountains. She was one of the most talented students in her department. Professors praised Leisha constantly and predicted a bright future for her. But like many of her classmates, she had to choose between her career and love. And could any other girl in her place have chosen differently? Ramona, you can't even imagine how wonderful he is. Leisha enthusiastically shared details about her beloved. He's so handsome and charming. All the girls in our faculty are crazy about him. Can you believe that he hasn't even graduated from college yet, and his parents have already given him a car? He wants to open his own chain of dental clinics in the future. It will be amazing. Look, Ramona said, be cautious with him. I've never trusted these sons of the rich and powerful. You know yourself, it's a time when we don't have any honest businessmen left. Those who could have stolen everything, and now, forgive me for being blunt, they're pushing all their wealth onto their adult children. Take your time, get to know him, and meet his parents. See how they treat you, don't rush. Getting married can wait. It's not the most important thing for you. Oh, come on. He's not like that at all, Leisha confidently asserted. He's well-mannered, intelligent, and comes from a good family. And what does it matter who his parents are? I have my room. If there's a need for a place, we can live there. Why do I need his mansions and wealth? Even if I don't win his parents over, what's the big deal? They'll come running when they miss their son, and then the grandkids will follow. I'm not worried about it at all. However, as it turned out, Leisha had been too carefree. For Marcelo, his parents' opinion held great importance. His future directly depended on it. Marcelo wasn't prepared to live in a modest room and work part-time while studying, and he couldn't convince his staunch mother that Leisha wasn't after marrying into a wealthy family to enrich herself. It's not just about money, Irma Gallego reasoned the morning after meeting the potential future daughter-in-law. If it were only about that, maybe I would have kept quiet. We could have found a way to protect you from this girl's mercenary motives. You could have married or divorced. Who in life doesn't make mistakes, especially in their youth? But Marcelo, you have no idea about her parents, and she hasn't seen them either and can't even imagine who they might be. I'm very concerned about this girl's genetics. You're not planning to marry for just a day. You'll have children. What if they turn out to be just like her potential parents, or even worse? I'm absolutely against this marriage, my son. I think your father will agree with me. Alejandro Gallego supported his wife. He saw the wisdom in Irma's words, and he was very dissatisfied with Marcelo's behavior, not hesitating to express his dissatisfaction every chance he got. You've completely neglected your studies. This is unacceptable, he protested every morning at the family breakfast. If this continues, forget about getting a good degree. And then what? I won't be able to support you throughout your life. You have to understand that I work in a completely different field. Yes, I have acquaintances in that sphere, but who would want to hire a doctor with nothing but failing grades during their practical training? You'll be responsible not for bags of potatoes, but for people's lives. You should understand that you're not a child anymore. And you have only this girl on your mind. If she's having such a negative influence on you, you need to break up with her immediately. For the next 10 years, your career should be your top priority, not family. So stop wallowing in self-pity, or else I'll take away your car and pocket money. You'll have to eat at the university cafeteria instead of fancy restaurants, and even with this, you won't be able to afford it without my help." Marcelo was in despair. On one hand, there was his beloved girlfriend, and on the other, his father's support and assistance. He understood that without Alejandro's help, he was unlikely to achieve anything significant. At university, he had always been an average student. He studied well, but it took him immense effort. "Marcelo, I have good news for you, even joyful," Licia said, smiling when he arrived at the university one day. On that day, she didn't even notice how sad and downcast Marcelo was. He found himself thinking that he had grown tired of his parents' constant moralizing. They lectured him every day, and it had become unbearable. More and more often, in his reflections, he came to the conclusion that it might be easier to go along with his parents and agree with their unwavering point of view. Licia's words pushed him to make a final and irreversible decision. That's when he realized he wasn't ready. "Dear, I don't know what advice to give you," Ramona lamented, trying to console Licia, who had been crying for 3 days. "But he's a good guy, isn't he?" "What? Did he just flat out say you should break up when he found out you're expecting a child? And his heart didn't skip a beat?" "I don't know," Licia replied tearfully. "I have no idea what's going on in his head. To me, it seems like he doesn't care at all. His mother made it clear that she doesn't want me as her daughter-in-law. And what about him? He's nothing. You understand that he depends entirely on them, on his father, who rules their family. Marcelo offered me money to solve the issue, but I refused it." "You shouldn't have done it," Ramona said thoughtfully. "Raising a child on your own is very difficult. You'll have to leave the university. And you probably won't be able to return. I'll help you as much as I can, but you have to understand that this is for life. Such decisions shouldn't be made impulsively. Take your time. You don't have to rush." "What are you talking about?" Licia protested. "I can't stand to see it. You suggest that I continue going there and see him every day. Are you out of your mind? Don't give up on your studies," Ramona urged. "He has nothing to do with your education, but you must finish it. Unless you want to spend your whole life cleaning toilets or perhaps standing in a vendor's booth. Don't be rash." 2 weeks later, Licia made her decision. After recovering from the procedure, she returned to college, which genuinely surprised Marcelo. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, encountering Licia in the hallway. "Have you changed your mind about having the baby?" "That's none of your business now," Licia replied firmly. "I did what I wanted. I'll figure it out on my own." We parted ways. Maybe it's for the best. "Licia, why are you making a scene?" Marcelo was surprised. "You understand everything perfectly well. I love you now, and we feel good around each other. But what about 5 or 10 years from now? What will become of us? I'll be working as a regular doctor, earning an average salary. You, at best, will become a nurse. Maybe, if you manage to combine a normal job with raising a child, you'll also become a doctor. But what then? Paying off a mortgage for the rest of our lives, counting every penny? Then having a second and third child and constantly worrying about expenses? I'm not ready for such a life, sorry. At least I've been honest with you and didn't beat around the bush. You're still young. You can have a whole army of kids. And I'm young, too. I have my whole life ahead of me. If my father helps me, I won't have to work at all. I'll work for a year or two somewhere, and then I'll open my own medical center. It's very profitable. And you don't even have to be a good doctor for that. Live your life as you wish," Licia said, turning away and walking in the opposite direction down the long college corridor. She didn't tell the young man how his father had cornered her near her home and practically pushed her into the car, begging her not to ruin Marcelo's life. She thought it was unnecessary for him to know. Leisha, Alejandro said politely, looking at the frightened girl, but you're not a foolish girl, and you understand everything perfectly well. I know you didn't listen to Marcelo, but maybe you'll listen to me at least? Understand, even if you have the baby and don't ask my son for any help, it's still a huge burden and a stain on our reputation as a family. Can you imagine what will happen when Marcelo wants to marry a decent, well-bred girl from our circle and she accidentally finds out that he already has a child with another woman? It's not good, but I think you'll agree with me. And you gain nothing from all these complications. As far as I know, you live alone in a small room, and the only support you have is your child care worker. And who will help you with the child? Think about it. You'll never rise above such a burden, and I know you're a very capable girl who can achieve a lot. Putting a business card with a phone number in her bag, Leisha silently got out of the car. In her mind, thoughts raced one after the other, contradicting each other. If I don't give up the child, what will I live on? She thought to herself. But it wasn't just that troubled her. She wanted to sever all ties with Marcelo, and leaving the child behind would make that impossible. A son or daughter would always remind Leisha of their father. It would cost me more, she reasoned after returning home from the hospital. I wouldn't be able to do it, I'd be thinking about them all the time, and it wouldn't be easy for them either. You did the right thing, Ramona reassured her. You'll see, time will heal everything. And don't even think about dropping out of college. Pretend you don't know each other, and he's nobody to you, just a blank space. Get him out of your head and out of your life. Continuing to attend college, Leisha ignored Marcelo. At first, he tried to maintain a friendly relationship with her, but after a few months, he started dating another classmate and stopped paying attention to Leisha. She found herself struggling to witness all of this. Leisha had a hard time suppressing her emotions, which were constantly trying to burst out. Only after graduating from university did she gradually begin to forget Marcelo. Lucia got a job at a nearby private clinic and focused on her career. A year later, she found herself thinking very little about him, but it was just an illusion. In reality, she never forgot Marcelo for a moment. Even after a terrible accident in which she lost not only her appearance but also parts of herself, Leisha still occasionally returned to thoughts of Marcelo. She constantly pondered how everything could have turned out so differently if she had kept her child. It just can't be, exclaimed an agitated Ramona when she received a call from the hospital. Yes, I heard about the accident. The minibus crashed into a pole and caught fire. The driver lost control. But the news said there were no survivors. Are you sure that the girl you're talking about, the one brought to the hospital by some man from the woods, is Leisha? I'm sure, replied the woman on the other end of the line. Her mobile phone miraculously survived, and we found only one contact in it, your number. Please come if you can. She's in very critical condition, but she will survive. An hour later, Ramona was already sitting in Leisha's hospital room, holding her hand. Leisha's entire body was wrapped in bandages, and her face was completely disfigured. During the time the woman had been in the room, she hadn't regained consciousness. An anxious Ramona went to speak with the doctor to find out if Leisha had any chance of recovery. However, as soon as she left the room, a stocky, respectable-looking man who hadn't left the hospital since he brought the miraculously surviving girl approached her. Hello, he said, looking directly at Ramona. Are you Leisha's mother? No, the woman replied. Leisha doesn't have a mother, she's an orphan. I'm, as they say, her caregiver. She used to live in the orphanage where I work. And who are you, may I ask? My name is Sancho Vasquez. I found Leisha on the road. I was driving home. You probably know that at the end of that road is a cottage community. Well, that's where I live. I saw an overturned minibus, everything around me was on fire. She was lucky that she was sitting in the front seat. When the minibus crashed into the pole, she was thrown out and landed several meters away. It's terrifying to think about what would have happened if I hadn't been on that road at that exact moment. I didn't even approach the place where everything was burning, there was no point in it. It was impossible to save anyone there. Poor girl, she's in terrible condition. Ramona didn't understand what this stranger wanted from her and why he suddenly seemed so concerned about Leisha's fate. But she didn't dare to ask openly. When Sancho invited her to visit him to discuss the girl's future, she declined. "You're suited to be her father," she said sternly. "Aren't you ashamed at all?" "You misunderstood me," replied the man. "I didn't mean anything like that. I just want to help, sincerely. You saw her condition for yourself, both physical and emotional. She needs more than just treatment and rehabilitation, she needs an operation. You saw that she has no good place on her face left. How will she live on? Why are you suddenly so interested in this? Why are you so concerned about the fate of a stranger, a girl you've never met before?" Ramona asked. "You shouldn't underestimate people. I want to help, and if I can provide support to Leisha, please take my phone number," the man replied, handing the woman his business card. "It includes the address of my office and my home, where I often conduct negotiations with partners. If you realize that you need my assistance, please call me anytime. I beg you not to reject this immediately and not to deprive Leisha of a chance for a new life. I will visit her." Sancho kept his word and visited Leisha almost every day. He tried not to pay much attention to Ramona, who remained skeptical of him. When Leisha finally regained consciousness, she was horrified to realize that she could hardly see anything. A bright light flickered before her in one eye, but it disappeared after a moment, leaving her immersed in darkness. This was particularly distressing for her. "I can't even imagine what I look like," she said, unable to shed tears. Ramona wouldn't have recognized Leisha if she didn't know it was her. The doctors were right, and Sancho's statement about her having no face was accurate. It was a description that couldn't have been more precise. "I went there for a new chandelier," Leisha mumbled. "I told you I ordered it specifically for the new renovation I was planning. It's the best shopping center in town, and they have good prices. I wanted to get something affordable and high quality." "You should have bought something a bit more expensive and of lower quality," Ramona sighed. It was painful for her to look at Lucia. Will she never be able to return to her usual life, she thought to herself, but she didn't dare say it out loud. Leisha already felt so downcast. She understood it all too well herself. Ramona didn't want to further upset her. "You do understand that she'll need surgery, and not just one," Sancho said when Ramona finally called him. The woman was willing to do anything to help Leisha. She had neither the money nor the means to do it herself, so she was prepared to seize any opportunity for Lucia to return to her previous life. "Yes, I understand," the woman nodded. "I understand it better than anyone else. What I don't understand is your motivation. Why do you need all of this? You're not going to tell me that you're willing to help just like that, with no ulterior motives, for a complete stranger." "I'll say it again, you shouldn't underestimate people," Sancho replied. "If you think I'm expecting something in return, you're mistaken. As you can probably tell, I'm lonely, terribly lonely. I just want to make someone happier because of me." He didn't divulge all of his cards to her, nor did he mention that he lost his wife and daughter. His own health was also hanging by a thread. Sancho didn't know how much time he had left and wanted to do something good in his life for once. Fate had never been kind to him. His mother was an alcoholic who struggled to raise her only son, constantly blaming Sancho for all of her misfortunes. She was at fault herself, but never wanted to admit it. He didn't even know who his father was. His mother had so many relationships that she occasionally compared Sancho to 3 different men. "Well, he definitely doesn't look like me," one drinking buddy would mumble, tongue-tied. "And he doesn't resemble me either," another would chime in. Sancho knew Salvador and Fernando from a very young age, but he didn't want either of them to be his father. They were long gone. All of his mother's drinking buddies eventually met the same fate: heart attacks, getting hit by a car, freezing to death outside, and Tina Vasquez kept on living, continuing to get on her son's nerves as much as she could. Sancho, do me a favor, she'd say with a squint, sitting at the kitchen table with her head resting on her hands. When are you going to get married again and have children? It's been so many years since the accident, and you still haven't found a new bride. I'm all alone here, you know. There's no one to play with and no one to talk to. It always irritated Sancho when his mother, who had never approached Laura in all the years of her life, started talking about grandchildren. Over the years, she couldn't even remember her granddaughter's name. Sancho had long since become accustomed to his mother's behavior, but he couldn't abandon her to her fate. Even in his youth, when he couldn't sleep at night and worked his way up from the very bottom, he made a promise to himself that no matter how his mother lived, he wouldn't leave her until the very end of her days. Back then, he didn't know that he would depart before her and that the woman would carelessly squander all of his hard-earned fortune by trusting the first random pauper she met. He couldn't have known that in advance, just as he couldn't have known that he would only have a week to have a legal wife and save his capital from his mother's stupidity and absurdity, a fortune he had been saving his entire life. See how well it turned out, and you were afraid and didn't want to go abroad. Sancho exclaimed. Of course, her vision has only partially been restored, but now Alicia can see with both eyes, albeit not as well as before all that happened. Alicia couldn't be happier. She couldn't believe her luck. She had a difficult time recalling the past year. Everything seemed shrouded in a fog. She tried her best not to dwell on the heavy thoughts that weighed on her. Looking at her new face in the mirror, Alicia increasingly came to the conclusion that she had become more beautiful than she was before. Why, I can't recognize you, Ramona, deeply concerned for the girl, said. But what about Sancho? Has he not hinted at anything during all this time? The woman was very afraid that sooner or later he would demand payment for the help he had provided. However, that never happened. Alicia didn't tell Ramona about her feelings towards him. She had a special fondness for him. The last time Alicia felt this way was when she was in love with Marcelo. These were long-forgotten emotions. When he betrayed her, she was convinced she would never love anyone again. However, after her surgeries and recovery, she increasingly found herself thinking that she wouldn't mind if Sancho showed interest in her. His age didn't bother her. On the contrary, Alicia was sure it would be even better if her future husband was older. Getting married, aren't you? Ramona strongly disapproved of Alicia's decision and was against the marriage. Well, if you've made up your mind, then go ahead. But aren't you at all bothered by the fact that he could be your father? It seems to me that there's quite an age difference between you two as husband and wife. If I were in your shoes, I'd think 100 times. It doesn't seem that way to me, the girl replied. Just think about it for yourself. What have I seen next to my peers? They're irresponsible and selfish. All boys cling to their mother's apron strings until life forces them away. And it doesn't matter what kind of family they come from, rich or poor. They will still cling to their mother's apron strings and then burden their wife throughout their lives. I've had enough of that kind of experience. I'm no longer of the age to adapt to someone else's parents' opinions. That won't happen with Sancho. We'll make a great couple. And if you haven't forgotten, I'm not getting any younger either. I'm no longer 18. After everything that happened to me, continuing my career is unlikely. I have practically no prospects, but at least there will be a family. Maybe I'll even start my own business. We'll see. When did you become so cynical? Ramona wondered. Alicia, you were never like this before. Suddenly, you're thinking about some benefits. You don't love him, and you know it perfectly well, and he knows it too. What's the point of such a family? What do you suggest, then? Having no family at all? I'm sure we'll be fine. By the way, can you help me prepare for the wedding? At that time, Alicia thought that nothing could disrupt her plans. She carefully selected her wedding dress, the restaurant, and the car they would ride in for the ceremony. It all seemed so important to her. She couldn't even imagine that in just a week, all of this would lose its meaning for her, and the joyful pre-wedding preparations would be replaced by the pain of loss that she would have to deal with for the next few years. Are you his daughter? The doctor asked when Leisha arrived at the hospital immediately after the call. I'm very sorry. No, I'm his fiancée, the girl replied, worried. What happened? Fiancé? Nowadays, it's become a trend to marry girls who could be your own daughters. The doctor's comments were not only rude but also inappropriate, but at that moment, Leisha didn't have the strength to argue with him. When the hospital's duty nurse called her, she hadn't informed Leisha about what had really happened. Since you're a fiancé, you won't inherit any wealth, the doctor replied sarcastically. Too late. Your betrothed called us very late. If he had called just 5 minutes earlier, maybe we could have saved him, but when he was brought to us, there was nothing we could do. We'll release the body to his mother. We've already contacted her. For all other matters, you can deal with her. We did everything we could. Leaving the hospital, Leisha ran into an elderly woman who reeked of alcohol. She could barely stand on her feet, and as she walked down the corridor, she mumbled something incoherent to herself. Leisha immediately realized that it was Sancho's mother but didn't dare to approach her. Aren't you going to the funeral at least? Ramona asked in surprise. How can you not say your goodbyes and give him a final farewell? I don't think it's appropriate, Leisha replied. None of his acquaintances or friends knew me and his mother. I'm more than certain she won't be pleased to see me. You know how unstable she is, not to mention that she's always intoxicated. I'll find out where he's buried. That's not difficult. I'll go and say my goodbyes. But I won't attend the actual funeral. Sitting at Sancho's grave a few days after his funeral, Leisha pondered how mundane and unfair fate could be. Why didn't you take better care of yourself? She sighed. You took care of others but treated yourself so carelessly. You didn't see doctors, and you were so stressed. That's why your heart couldn't take it. After spending about an hour at the cemetery, she headed home. I need to figure out how to live on, she thought to herself, completely unaware that her life would soon be filled with joyless days. Unfortunately, we cannot take you back to work, Leisha heard from the chief physician of the clinic where she worked before the accident. You understand that you have a significant gap in your work history without valid reasons. But it's not just that. You've undergone so many surgeries. Your health condition is a cause for concern, and as you know, our working day is 8, sometimes 9 hours long. There's a lot of work, patients one after another. Plus, you have serious vision problems. No, I'm sorry. Despite all our respect and sympathy for you, the answer is no. I think you'll have to say goodbye to your medical practice forever. Leisha received similar responses from all the other clinics where she tried to find work. Even in those hospitals where she tried to hide her health condition, she was turned down. Are they heartless or what? Ramona exclaimed. As if all our doctors are in perfect health. Besides, your job as a dentist isn't exactly physically demanding. You don't need superhuman strength to treat teeth. It's not about that, Leisha sighed. It's about my vision. Honestly, I'm afraid that I might not see something important, or worse, I might faint during a working day. You remember how I passed out right after returning from abroad? What's the guarantee that it won't happen again? To be honest, I lean towards thinking that my medical practice is over for good. My vision is poor, and I don't feel well either. And then all of this happened. I still can't believe he's gone. He did so much good for me. Ramona tried to console Leisha, who had never allowed herself to display such strong emotions before. I'm sorry, she said when she stopped crying. I won't do it again, I promise. We have to figure out how to move on. After all, I should be grateful that they restored my face. Can you imagine what my life would be like right now if it weren't for Sancho? I can, Ramona sadly replied. Equals it wouldn't just be an unpleasant sight, but it's also unclear how you would live without a face or without your eyesight. Thanks to Sancho, you only have some minor scars left on your body, and most of them were removed almost painlessly. What can I say? Not entirely painless. I just didn't complain. I don't like to cry over trivial things, you know. I will always be grateful to him for everything he did for me. He was an extraordinary person. After calling several more clinics and attending interviews, Leisha decided not to test her luck further. She went to the hospital near her home and asked if they needed nurses. "We're currently short-staffed," the woman at the reception muttered to herself. "I'll call the chief physician. You can talk to him. We've recently opened. They've built a new hospital. Until now, there was only one in the entire district. People don't know where to go. Everywhere, there are long lines. And the ambulances are running ragged. Hopefully, things will improve now that we have better funding. As they say, it's the same old story. Thanks to our sponsor, who allocated funds for the construction of the new hospital." Leisha didn't catch the sponsor's last name, but she noted to herself that there wasn't a hospital at this location just a few years ago. She was surprised when she stumbled upon it on her way to the old combined district clinic. At first, she thought she had the wrong address, but decided to go, and out of curiosity, maybe luck would be on her side. "You can't even imagine who they brought to us," Leisha exclaimed. "I never thought that fate would bring us together again after all these years and under such circumstances." "What are you talking about?" Ramona asked in surprise. "Leisha, you're speaking in riddles. I don't understand you." For over 7 years, Leisha had worked as an orderly in the hospital, and she was content with her life. After a few months of starting this job, she had completely forgotten about returning to medical practice. "But isn't this all risky?" Ramona worried. "All these unofficial bonuses and envelopes could backfire later." "No," Leisha confidently replied. "There won't be any consequences for this. The chief physician negotiates with the patients for what's called extra special service, and I simply do my job and get paid for it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's much better than running from patient to patient for 10 hours a day, and you can never earn so much in an ordinary hospital. I've already saved up some money. Soon, I'll be able to exchange this room for a small apartment with some extra payment. Where else can you make this kind of money? Their patients are well off. And if they want someone to read books to them and engage in conversations, not just clean their rooms and mop the floors, let them pay. I believe the chief physician is fair in charging them. It won't hurt them because they have money, and we're doing well." When the ambulance brought him, Leisha couldn't believe her eyes at first. He was unconscious. Entering his room after they transferred him from the operating room, she tried to be as quiet as possible so he wouldn't wake up. In fact, he would never recognize her, but she wasn't prepared to come face to face with him right now, to look him in the eyes and talk to him. "And what happened to him?" Ramona asked. "Is it really that serious?" "Very serious. You can't even imagine," she replied with a sigh. "According to what the doctor said, he'll be disabled if he survives at all. He's currently on life support, and it's doubtful he'd even regain consciousness. But I did everything very quickly, just in case he woke up. I'm not ready to talk to him yet, not ready at all." "But he won't know that it's you," Ramona chuckled. "What's there to be afraid of? He won't recognize my appearance, but according to the documents, I'm still the same person. As far as I know, he or his father sponsor this hospital. Who's going to figure it out? They have a family coalition going on. They scratch each other's backs, so if he sees my initials, that's it, I'm in trouble." "Oh, come on. Like they'll be reporting to him about some orderly. You're imagining things. How do you even know that he or his father sponsor this hospital? I forgot to tell you. It was quite the story. You can't even imagine." So, I approach his room, and there are his wife and some guy. "His wife? She's probably a beauty, worried about her husband." "Not at all. She can't stand him, and this guy. In short, they wanted to send him to the afterlife. It's a real nightmare." Ramona was horrified, while Leisha was thinking about the conversation between Carolina and the young man who was with her in the hospital. Carolina's fate couldn't be called happy, and for 5 years she had been trying every possible way to get rid of her unloved husband and finally live freely. She couldn't convince her father not to marry her off to someone she felt nothing but disgust for. "I told you, you're not going to marry Carmelo," Alfredo Domingo scolded his daughter during another argument. "Our family doesn't need such a son-in-law. Where did you even find him? He works on some dives. He's barely out of his mother's womb, and he's already thinking about getting married. He'll never earn a decent living with a wife like you, I can tell you that." "Dad, I'm already an adult," Carolina protested. "We don't live in the past, when fathers chose husbands for their daughters and sons chose wives. I'm a free person, and I want to spend my life with someone I love." "I don't care if it's love or not," Alfredo Dmitrievic waved her off. "You're still too young. You're a hothead. You're 18 now, and you're in love with this half-baked artist. In 5 years, you'll realize that you can't count pennies with him forever and survive in poverty, and you'll stop loving him immediately, but then it will be too late. Listen to your father. He knows better what you need. You'll marry Marcelo, and that's not up for discussion. It's a settled matter. Next week, I'm meeting with Alejandro to discuss your engagement and the terms of the marriage contract. Dad, aren't you bothered by the fact that he's 31 years old and I, your daughter, am only 18? What are we going to do about that? When I'm 30, he'll be 40. I'm still young, and by that time, he'll be an aging ladies' man, and in 10 years, he'll struggle to move around the apartment when I'm still in my prime. Don't you think it's too much? 10 years is a whole lifetime, you know. I want to marry someone my age so we can do everything together and have things to talk about. And what surprises me even more is how casually you talk about parents arranging the marriage of a 30-year-old adult man. Aren't you even a bit amused? You're not even talking to him, you're talking to his father. Do you seriously think this is normal? What does your precious Marcelo even have? A chain of dental clinics? Ha ha. I could laugh my head off. He should be playing in the sandbox, not running things. His intelligence and maturity level suit him perfectly. Carolina, how dare you talk to your father like that? Eleonora Domingo, who had entered the room, interjected. Stop this argument right now. What's gotten into you? How good it is that you came, Alfredo thanked his wife. A bit more, and I would have given her a good slap. She has no respect for her father or mother. She's completely unruly. Actually, it's a good thing that the husband will be older. He'll tame her stubborn character, and his father will help him with that. After saying goodbye to his wife, Alfredo left the room, leaving Carolina alone with her mother, who always supported her husband in everything. Why are you looking at me like that, Mom? Carolina continued to protest. Don't you and Dad understand, or do you just not want to understand me at all? Neither you nor Dad. I love Carmelo, and I want to marry him, not some Marcelo who builds hospitals and houses all over the city or whatever else he does. Don't you understand that Marcelo is a nobody? He's worthless and absolutely empty. He'll cling to his dad his whole life, and I'll have to do the same. No independent life. We'll spend our whole lives under Alejandro's dictatorship, doing whatever he says. Is that the life you want for me? And why do I need education, upbringing, and all that? For what? Eleonora didn't know how to respond to her daughter. She couldn't find the right words. She herself had married early. She had never felt love for her husband, but they were a good match. Both of them were well-mannered, educated, and from intellectual families. They got along well together. They were perfect for each other. Eleonora couldn't understand Carolina's feelings. At her age, she never thought about love. Her mind was occupied with studying, reading books, and science, anything but love. Deep down, Eleonora realized that she had married out of necessity rather than desire. It was just something you had to do, something that was customary. She had always believed that a woman should not live for herself alone. This was wrong. From childhood, her mother instilled in her the belief that a husband and children were an integral part of any woman's life. She didn't even dare to think differently. Eleonora tried to convince Carolina of the same, but all such conversations always ended in arguments. Her daughter refused to agree with her mother and always staunchly defended her own point of view. Our daughter is growing up stubborn, but that's okay. Life will teach her, and everything will fall into place, Alfredo had been saying since Carolina became a teenager. When Carolina turned 16, conflicts began to arise in the family. Carolina argued with her mother and father over everything and nothing, which greatly irritated her parents. They constantly remarked to each other during conversations how much their daughter had changed in just a few years. Both Eleonora and Alfredo were accustomed to their daughter always being obedient, so the sudden changes in her character took them completely by surprise. But they were confident that with time, Carolina would change for the better and family disagreements would cease. Alfredo was convinced that this was how it would be, so he made plans for the future, considering only his own interests and goals. He ignored the fact that Carolina had every right to independently determine her fate and build her own life as she saw fit. Merging with Alejandro was his long-standing dream, and every time the subject came up, he enthusiastically talked about his future prospects. "Eleonora, just imagine if I can use his money and resources for my business," the man exclaimed. "I'll become 5, maybe even 10 times richer in just a couple of years. If we team up, I can earn in a year what I've been working for 5, maybe 7 years on my own." "You're right," Eleonora replied thoughtfully. "It wouldn't be bad for our family to have connections with such a person. But you see, he won't just give away money like that to anyone. What am I to him? A business partner. But he has plenty of people like me. We need to reach a different, much higher level of relationship with him." Eleonora immediately thought of Alejandro's son, and Alfredo found this to be a good idea. "As always, you're right, Eleonora," he agreed, holding his wife's hand. "But do you realize that our Carolina is only 14, and Marcelo, their son, is already a grown man? He's managing things on his own. Alejandro keeps talking about him with such pride that it takes your breath away. By the time our girl matures, he will have married 100 times over. Of course, he's not exactly Alain Delon, but he's not ugly either. Such guys are in high demand among young ladies. Who would let him get married?" Eleonora chuckled. "Alejandro is a man of action, and you know that well. I doubt he'd let his son bring a girl from the street into the house. But what if not from the street? What if someone from our circle or from a similarly respectable family? I don't think Alejandro would object if Marcelo fell in love with a good girl. Maybe we should somehow prepare the ground in advance," Alfredo pondered. "What's the problem, then? Talk to him openly and say something like, 'We have goods, you have a buyer. We just have to wait a few years.' That way, you can find out Marcelo's plans for his future life and what's going on in his personal life right now." When discussing his son's personal life, Alejandro was only distressed. He was disappointed in Marcelo's behavior, as he had long lost count of the endless one-night stands. "He doesn't want to get married," he said, tapping his fingers on the table. "I've introduced him to so many respectable young ladies. Daughters of respectable people. But with many of these, with whom we could have built strong business relationships, and he's just not interested. He had a romance at the university. Oh, how much Irma and I suffered because of it. He even wanted to run away to live in a room with some raggedy girl. But luckily, he came to his senses, his mother insisted. Thank her for that. If it weren't for Irma, I can't even imagine what I would have done. Unmanageable." "I understand," Alfredo lamented. "Our daughter is still calm for now, but that's only for now. Later on, who knows what will happen? I want her to not delay marriage, like modern girls these days, fall in love, fall out of love, 30 years old, no husband, no children. And if you try to say anything about it, they'll shut you up and brush you off, saying they haven't had enough fun yet. I won't allow Carolina to do that. As soon as she turns 18, I'll arrange her marriage. She'll marry the man I choose, no tricks, or she'll have to deal with the consequences. I heard a lot about raggedy boys and girls. It seemed like life was treating them with kindness. They were constantly attaching themselves to young men from respectable families. You had to find someone of your own caliber for them. What would some village lad have to talk about with my daughter? I told him the same thing when he was dating someone at university, that Felicia or Alicia girl, I don't remember exactly what her name was, Alejandro recalled. He acted all high and mighty, but then he realized I could take extreme measures, like cutting off his allowance or something. He calmed down, and since then, he's been chasing after women like a man possessed. It was tolerable while he was in college, but as soon as he graduated, worked, and got into business, it all went downhill. He's unstoppable. Sometimes I even think I shouldn't have helped him get back on his feet so quickly. Maybe if he had to toil like everyone else, he wouldn't be like this. But no worries, in a few more years, I'll settle the marriage issue. I just haven't taken it seriously yet. The men understood each other with just a few words. That day, Alfredo returned home in high spirits. "Eleonora, you can congratulate me," he exclaimed. "I've found a husband for our daughter. We'll wait for about 4 years, and Alejandro and his son will have to deal with the matter while we'll grow along with it. Just don't say anything to Carolina. She's too young to delve into such intricacies right now. But I'm more than sure that I'll manage to secure funding for my projects long before the wedding." When Alfredo, who had hoped for his daughter's compliance, learned that Carolina had fallen in love, he got angry. In that year, Eleonora had gone to spend the entire summer with her mother, who had long bid farewell to city life and, being retired for several years now, enjoyed the fresh air in one of the small country settlements located not far from the city. "Mom, but we're not poor," Eleonora lamented when she found out that her mother planned to renovate her late grandfather's old house and move in. "We could buy you a cottage, at the very least, or even build one if you really like this place so much. Why do you need this half-ruined old house?" "You don't understand a thing," Eleonora, Agata replied. "This place, among other things, is our family heritage. My father would never forgive me if I abandoned it or let it fall into disrepair. As for all these cottages and houses of yours, I have no use for them. I've worked all my life to retire one day and, sitting by the window in this house, write books." "Mom, it turns out you're a romantic," Eleonora said in surprise. "It's a pity Dad isn't around anymore. It would have been easier for me to handle you." A year later, they both regretted their decision. It had been too hasty for them. "Mom, I begged you, I implored you to keep an eye on her," Eleonora scolded, placing all the blame on her mother. "I told you right away, no local discos, no trips to neighboring villages and settlements, and what did you do? Where have you been yourself?" Agata retorted, undaunted. "You said you were planning to spend the entire summer here, and then you disappeared to the city after just a month. You claimed you had important matters to attend to. What kind of important matters could you have when Alfredo decides everything in your life? You could have spent time with your daughter. Everything that happened is not my fault, but your upbringing. If you've already practically arranged her future wedding with someone, you should have informed Carolina about it." When Carolina returned to the city on her own, accompanied not only by herself, but also by a young man she introduced to her parents on the very first day after her return, Eleonora and Alfredo were shocked. "Eleonora, I don't understand. What is this?" Alfredo exclaimed in anger. "What on earth happened at that damn place? Where was your mother, whom you left our daughter with?" "I don't know," the woman muttered guiltily. "I'll definitely find out everything. Don't worry so much. I'm sure nothing like that happened between them. Don't get angry, and don't shout. I'm sure that Carolina would never go against the family. In general, we didn't quite handle it correctly. We should have told her that right after the first semester, she would marry Marcelo. Do you remember how he looked at her at that event we all attended together? It was clear right away that our girl made a strong impression on him. And Alejandro, too. He immediately said he wanted to marry Carolina. You told me that yourself. That's true, Alfredo exclaimed. But what are we going to do about that country boy she brought with her to the city? Did you hear how she casually asked me to help him with housing and finding a job? It sounded like they were heading to the civil registry tomorrow. Please explain to your daughter that there will be no wedding. I might help the guy, but he shouldn't even dream of getting my approval for this marriage. Carolina will marry Marcelo, and she should forget about her Carmelo. Carolina herself hadn't noticed how quickly everything had escalated. When family arguments had reached their limits, Alfredo would stop insisting on the wedding and even pretend to have accepted his daughter's choice. But she realized that this couldn't go on like this. Eleonora came to the same conclusion as she grew increasingly concerned about her husband's new projects and their financing. Daughter, listen to me, please, Eleonora replied. You need to make a decision. Your father is having problems at work. You understand that Alejandro won't solve them forever. We're taking a huge risk. We could lose everything. The woman hesitated for a long time before deciding to have an open conversation with her daughter. She carefully observed Carolina's behavior, who had also grown tired of the constant conflict. When Eleonora sensed that her daughter was no longer able to live the way she had, she finally mustered the courage to talk to her. Mom, I understand everything, Carolina responded. You don't have to treat me like a fool. Marcelo has been pretending to be our friend for almost a year now. Alejandro is trying to impress everyone at events where we meet. He even hired Carmelo. He acted like a fool, took out loans, immediately bought an apartment, a car, and an expensive phone, and sent money to his mother and sisters. He's sure he can pay it all back. It's just that now it's unclear how long he'll have to toil for that old man. Carolina, don't talk like that, Eleonora protested. That's not right. It's his choice, and he made it himself. After moving here, he initially rented modest accommodation, worked somewhere, and even enrolled in college. He could have continued to live that way. He could have, or not, it doesn't matter, Carolina retorted. Mom, you're being naive. Do you think he really wants to live like that? Everyone wants to live well. But now we're all hostages to the situation that has developed. Alejandro won't leave my father, just like he won't leave Carmelo. Marcelo is drooling over me. Don't you remember how he stared at me in the restaurant? He almost popped his eyes out. He's just waiting for me to finally get tired of all this and accept the reality we've all ended up in. And what about Dad? Why did he need all these projects? Were his own not enough? We've always lived well, even without Alejandro and his money. We would have continued to live well, but no. What we had, or more accurately, have, wasn't enough for us. All this has led to caves and hopelessness. It could have been different if Dad had used his head. Eleonora couldn't blame her husband. She felt that she had no right to do so. He always emceed all families' decisions, and for many years, Alfredo had managed to do it quite successfully. Carolina, you have to understand by now that everyone faces problems. No one is immune to them, and your father is no exception, Eleonora said. What's done is done. It happened, and we can't change it now. Yes, Mom, it just happened, Carolina replied. You're right. It just happened on its own that my father can only solve his problems if I marry Marcelo, which he promised me years ago for some reason. It's not Dad's fault, it just happened. I find it touching how you always defend him, Carolina continued. No matter what he does, you always find a reason for him to be poor and unhappy, while everyone else is to blame. Carolina was frustrated with the unfolding situation, where everyone else seemed to have an escape plan except her. Before making one of the most important decisions in her life and realizing she was making a huge mistake, she decided to express everything she thought to her mother. Until this point, Carolina had never allowed herself to be so open and straightforward. But what about I don't even know what to call him, your young man. He's also getting settled at your expense. But for some reason, that doesn't bother you. You blame everything on Dad. What did you suggest I do, Mom? Leave my own home? Abandon everything? What was I supposed to do? I had no idea about any arrangements. Who gave Dad the right to negotiate something for me? What a story. Two grown men decided their children's fates. And Marcelo, by the way, is not even 18 or 20 years old. He's already over 30. And what if he didn't want to marry me? What would your praised Alejandro do then? Drag him to the civil registry by hand. It's funny. Carolina, please don't exaggerate. Marcelo likes you, he loves you. Why complicate everything? There's really no need. But Dad should have, before negotiating anything, at least asked me if I loved him. And I don't love him. But we, all of us, have no way out. Why do you take everything so personally? If you don't love him, then reject him once and for all. It's easy to say. Who asked Dad to take money from that Alejandro crocodile? He'll never work off that debt in his lifetime. Even if we sell everything and move to live at the train station, we'll still owe him. And all the bumps and sticks always end up with Carolina, who can't decide anything. As soon as something happens, it's all about Carolina, save the family. 2 weeks after her conversation with her mother, Carolina told Carmelo that they needed to break up. Are you kidding? Carmelo asked in surprise, not understanding what was happening. No, Carmelo, I'm not, Carolina replied. I'm completely serious. I'm marrying Marcelo. But why? What happened? Everything was so good, the young man said. What's good, Carmelo? I won't go into details. I'll just say it to you. It's a family matter, and it's been decided for a long time. I just never told you about it. It won't change anything in your life. Everything will stay the same. You can keep working for Alejandro, making money, paying off your loans, and helping your mother and sisters. But will we still see each other? His words sounded so foolish that Carolina couldn't take it anymore and walked away. She couldn't answer these silly questions, which he would ask endlessly, because she herself didn't have answers. 3 months later, she married Marcelo. Her father couldn't have been happier. In just a few weeks, he resolved all his debt issues that had been hanging over him for almost a year. Daughter, I'm so glad you made the right choice, Eleonora said, to which Carolina simply nodded. She was confident that she could forget about Carmelo. They occasionally crossed paths at events Carolina didn't like attending, and whenever possible, she preferred to stay home. Do I really have to go there? She asked Marcelo every time her husband was preparing for another social gathering. You have to, he replied. You're my wife, and you should accompany me to all the events. Do you want Dad to start asking if you're feeling okay and everything is all right with you again? Sometimes she found herself wishing he would disappear and dissolve into thin air, as if he had never existed. Carolina played the role of the faithful wife for the first year of their marriage and started seeing Carmelo again. She found any excuse to go to work with her father-in-law. By that time, Carolina had become actively involved in business, using the money her father had allocated for her as an heir, provided she got married with Alfredo's consent. Consequently, there were many questions, from simple document confusion to the specifics of negotiations. Why don't you ever consult with your father? Alejandro casually asked her. He knows just as much about these matters as I do. Your specialty is closer, she replied, constantly thinking only about making sure he didn't suspect anything. In public, in Carolina's presence, Carmelo pretended that he had coincidentally met an old acquaintance. He was friendly, courteous, and polite. It was only when Alejandro left the office that he allowed his true feelings to surface. If he finds out, it will be very bad, Carolina would say, entering the office and locking the door. And what if someone sees us? Relax, he said. As if you don't know his office workers. They are all occupied with their own tasks, and nobody cares about anyone else. He keeps them so busy with work that they, at best, emerge from their lairs only in the evening. Many of them don't even have time for lunch. I would prefer a hotel, Carolina reasoned. Just think about it. How long can we keep meeting like this? Sooner or later, he will find out. Can you imagine the scandal? The dumbest thing we can do in our situation is to meet at a hotel. If your husband or his dad instructed someone to keep an eye on you, photos of our meetings would immediately appear on Marcelo's desk. Here you came for work, that's my specialty too. He himself said, if anything, asked Carmelo. He's excellent at everything. So, you're asking. I don't see a problem. He was right. They managed to keep it hidden for several years. Even Carolina's mother, who had always been perceptive and had good intuition, never once thought that a relationship had rekindled between them. To divert attention, Carmelo introduced Nora from the procurement department as his fiancée and appeared at all events with her, secretly carving out time for his clandestine meetings with Carolina. It's getting too complicated, she said one day. This can't go on any longer. Marcelo has already mentioned that he wants children. I'm doing my best to handle it, Carmelo, but it's really hard for me. We need to do something. What can you do when, according to the terms of the prenuptial agreement, you get nothing in the case of a divorce? As far as I understand it, all of Marcelo's property will only pass to you in the event of his death, the young man pondered. In terms of business, you are entirely dependent on your father, and even though they sorted out all issues with debts and financing immediately after you married Marcelo, Alejandro can still put the squeeze on him in such a way that... You know what I mean. And you're not suggesting we get rid of Marcelo. No, that's too risky. Although, Carolina, that's a bad idea. It's fraught with very serious consequences. How I wish he would just disappear. You can't even imagine how much I want that. You know, accidents happen, or something like that. How simple everything would become then. I'd be a widow and a wealthy heiress. I'd mourn for a year, and that's it, I could move on. Everyone would sympathize with me and encourage me. My mother would start lamenting that I'm still young and have my whole life ahead of me and that I shouldn't dwell on it. My father would support her. How wonderful it would be if he were gone. A week later, she thanked her lucky stars that her words had been heard. When she received a call informing her that Marcelo's car had collided with a truck carrying paint barrels and the driver, losing control, accidentally spilled all the paint barrels onto the car behind, Carolina's heart raced with anxiety. I hope you didn't pay someone to cause this accident? Carmelo asked, worried. No, it wasn't me, but this is our chance, Carolina quickly muttered. I'm waiting for you at the hospital this evening. Just don't call me. All right, Carmelo replied, and, succumbing to Carolina's persuasion, she reluctantly agreed to do what she asked. Young man, what are you doing here? Leisha asked, entering the hospital room and seeing Carmelo standing very close to the artificial respiration machine, attempting to unplug it from the socket. What were you about to do? Me? Carmelo stammered, flustered. Nothing, I'm his friend. I just came to check on him. I thought the plug was coming loose. What plug? What nonsense are you talking about? Everything's fine, I checked it. I'm leaving now, sorry. Carmelo rushed out of the room like a bullet, and, turning the corner where Carolina was waiting for him, he nervously muttered. I'm not getting involved in this anymore. I was almost caught red-handed. Carolina, where were you looking? You were supposed to keep watch. Who did it? There was no one here, Carolina replied, equally frightened. The nurse. She appeared out of nowhere. I had almost pulled that stupid machine out. Only a few minutes were left, and she ruined everything. At that moment, footsteps could be heard in the corridor, and upon recognizing familiar voices, Carolina grabbed Carmelo by the hand and dragged him towards the fire escape. What's going on? Where are you leading me? He asked. Carolina, for God's sake, what's going on? Marcelo's parents have arrived, she whispered. Didn't you recognize Alejandro's voice? That's it, go from here. You'll exit through the back door. We'll figure it out later. I'll wait here. I'll join them afterwards. 15 minutes later, Carolina entered the room where Alejandro and Irma were already seated. Alejandro was holding his son's hand, and Irma was struggling to hold back tears. "My son, how did this happen?" Alejandro lamented. "There are so many idiots on the road nowadays. They almost killed you." "Just live, my son," Irma whispered through tears. "Just live, everything else doesn't matter." Only after a few minutes, Alejandro Viktorovich turned and, upon seeing the young woman, offered her his seat. "Sorry, we didn't notice you," he said. "Please, have a seat. I'm leaving now. It's time for me to go to the office. By the way, Carmelo was supposed to prepare your documents there." "Yes, I remember," mumbled Carolina, who didn't know where to look, avoiding the gaze of her mother-in-law and father-in-law. They spent nearly the entire day at the hospital. After learning the prognosis from the chief physician, Irma returned to the room even more subdued than she had been when she arrived in the morning. "They don't even know when he'll wake up or if he ever will," she said. "But they said he should. However, he's unlikely to ever return to his normal life. The injuries are too severe. Most likely, Marcelo will remain disabled." She burst into tears, and Carolina began to sympathize with the despairing mother-in-law. The young woman was experiencing mixed emotions. She felt both shame and sorrow towards Marcelo, whom she had tried to harm with her own hands just 5 minutes ago. At the same time, for the first time in many years, she felt a sense of relief. If her husband, assuming he would recover, needed a caregiver, Carolina wouldn't have to be the one to lie in the same bed with him, go on joint vacations, dine at restaurants on weekends, and attend the events she despised. Marcelo regained consciousness a month later, and after summoning Lisha, who was diligently cleaning the room that day, he asked, "Tell me, does anyone love me?" Hearing his voice, she got scared and immediately ran to fetch a doctor. "Marcelo, you mustn't worry. Save your strength," the woman who rushed into the room babbled. By the time of his discharge, they needed to find a caregiver, and Marcelo felt he had the right to choose the person who would spend the next few months, or perhaps even years, with him. While doctors provided no prognosis, the hope that he might someday be able to stand on his own 2 feet still lingered, and Marcelo clung to it like a lifeline. "I would like the woman who cleans my room and changes the bedding here at the hospital to take care of me," he said. "All right, we'll speak to her today," Alejandro replied. Upon seeing Lisha's documents, Marcelo found her name strangely familiar. "Tell me, have we ever crossed paths before?" he asked. "Maybe, I don't know," Lisha replied. "I've been working at this hospital for a long time. Perhaps we have." Marcelo recognized her several months later, when she moved into a separate room in his apartment to be with him around the clock. By that time, Carolina sometimes didn't even return home to spend the night. Her parents visited periodically, so most of the time Marcelo and Lisha spent together. She not only cared for him but also read him books. They watched movies together and talked about life. As he wheeled around the apartment in his wheelchair, he accidentally saw her changing her sweater. "It can't be," he thought to himself and, getting closer, grabbed her hand. "What are you doing?" Lisha asked, bewildered. She hadn't managed to pull up her sleeve, so she stood there halfway in one shirt. "So it's you," Marcelo whispered. "What happened to you? Why have you changed so much?" She immediately realized that he had spotted a large birthmark in the shape of a loop on her arm, which she had had since birth. There was no point in denying it. Lisha had no choice but to admit that she was who she was. He asked her for forgiveness for his youthful mistakes every day. She listened and remained silent. A month later, he filed for divorce from Carolina. She returned to Carmelo, and Marcelo proposed to Lisha without even waiting for her consent. "I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me," he repeated the same phrase like a memorized verse. It was only when she responded with agreement that he realized he had been forgiven and felt relief. After undergoing several surgeries, Marcelo was able to stand on his own 2 feet 2 years later. Alejandro and Alfredo no longer meddled in their children's lives, and their wives followed suit. Let them live as they see want, Alejandro said, reflecting on how his son's life might have turned out if he hadn't prevented him from marrying Licia in his youth, only to meet her later and experience so much pain. Yep, we should stop, Irma added, supporting her husband. Our child is almost 40 years old.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.